Hi, my name is Melinda Karp, and I want to welcome you to the SUNY Guided Pathways overview session. This session is designed to prepare you for the Pathways Institute in April. The idea here is to give you a refresher or a first orientation to the Guided Pathways model so that when you come to the Institute, you understand where we're headed and why. So what we're going to do in the next 15 minutes or so is give you a very, very high level overview of Guided Pathways. We'll start with the reason that we're talking about institutional transformation. Then we'll move into what Guided Pathways look like and give you some examples from colleges throughout the SUNY system. And then we'll talk a little bit about what makes the Guided Pathways model within SUNY unique. And so hopefully that means that when you come to the Institute, you'll feel grounded in where we're headed. Like I said, we will have the opportunity to chat a little bit more. If you have questions, there is a breakout session available to continue to orient you. And then hopefully you can move into the team time and also bring this information back to your colleagues so that at your institutions, Guided Pathways become something that feels increasingly familiar. So let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about why are we restructuring community colleges? So you may have noticed that Guided Pathways is not a program. It's not a thing. It's an argument for rethinking all of the ways that we do business within community colleges to better support our students to get them to completion. And so it's important to start at the beginning and understand why we think it's important to take on such a big initiative, right? So why are we talking about revamping everything? Where did that come from? Why are we doing this heavy lift? And that really requires us to go back almost 15 years at this point. So this is a graph of college completion rates in the community college sector. It's IPEDS, so it's imperfect, first-time, full-time students. And the scale along the bottom is the cohort year of which students started. And then they have 3 years to complete. And this graph illustrates that from 2002, that entering cohort in 2002, all the way up till about our 2011 cohort, completion rates were stagnant. And what's important to note about this is two things. First of all, everything up here, those are all students who came to our institutions who intended to complete or transfer and who didn't. And so these are human lives. And for a long time, we were not moving the needle on making sure that more of our students' aspirations were actually being achieved. The other thing to note is this arrow down here. 2004 is the beginning of Achieving the Dream, which I like to use as a proxy for an intense focus within our sector on shifting from access to completion, really thinking about how do we make sure that students complete. And you'll see that for almost a decade, despite those efforts, rates were flat. And so that really created a conundrum, a puzzle to understand why, if we're working so hard, lots of smart people, lots of dedicated people are working so hard to improve this slope, which does start to happen very slowly later on, you can see. But why were we not moving the needle? And so researchers and practitioners started interrogating this, like what was happening? And what they came to realize was that it wasn't a lack of initiative. It wasn't a lack of excellent programming. It wasn't a lack of excellent people. Instead, there were a couple of things happening at the underlying structures of the institutions that were impeding the overall student success rate. The first thing they noticed was the community colleges, because they were designed for access, are set up like a cafeteria. So there's something for everyone. There are a gazillion choices curricularly. There are lots of programs, lots of degrees, lots of support services, but they're all just there to pick and choose from. And so that means that students' pathways to completion are unclear. They can pick and choose lots of things, but they may not actually make them into a coherent program that gets them to graduate. There are lots of ways that you can't monitor students in a cafeteria program. There are lots of learning outcomes, but they're not really looked at coherently. So this cafeteria structure, which was designed as in a moment of access, right, that's what we cared about, didn't actually work when we care about completion. The other thing we noticed was that the traditional reform efforts were only touching parts of the college. And that showed up in two different ways. The first, I like to look, it's on my left, We would touch just a part of the college. We'd fix developmental education, or we'd improve a specific program of study. And in doing so, I like to think of that as we'd pull students out of a lake. They were no longer drowning, but we'd leave them in the messy forest of other pieces of the institution that had not yet been touched by that reform. And so they still got lost on their path to graduation. So there was a lot of fixing pieces of the puzzle, but not the whole thing. The other thing that was happening on the right side was that what I like to call islands of excellence. We had amazing programs, EOPS, TRIO, CUNY ASAP, minority male initiatives, honors programs, athletes that touched a small number of students. They were on these islands of excellence, and we learned a lot from them, right? Of how you can get students to completion. But they only touched a few students, and they left everyone else still drowning in that sea and not getting to graduation. And so when we realized that, we realized those overall numbers I showed you just a moment ago weren't moving because these islands of excellence and these fragmented pieces of reforms weren't touching enough students to, in the aggregate, move our completion numbers, and they were leaving many students out. And so what that did was it made us realize, well, we can't just change pieces of the college. If it's the full structure of the institution, we need to really think about how we've structured our institution and shift that so that every student gets those islands of excellence. And that's really where Guided Pathways came from. And of course, lots been written about Guided Pathways. There's a book, if you haven't read it and you're feeling like you need more information or you want to understand the research base, I'd highly recommend going to the actual text. But I'll give you a quick overview, because essentially what Guided Pathways is an argument for institutional reform going to scale so that all students get this intentionally designed, coherent, sort of opposite of a cafeteria approach. And that's true for everyone. And that doesn't mean that you don't take into account the different needs of students. But what it does mean is that every student has access to a thoughtful pathway that meets them where they are, figures out where they're going, and keeps them there. And it uses a set of design principles. We call them the 4 pillars. You'll hear about them a lot at institutes that basically argue for the opposite of a cafeteria. It's the counterfactual. They say, if the cafeteria is too much of a smorgasbord, let's create clear pathways. If the cafeteria cannot create a situation where we can monitor all of their students and intervene early enough, let's create that, again, intentionally and at scale. I use the term design principles to describe the 4 pillars very deliberately. The Guided Pathways model is not a recipe. It's not a specific set of features or things you have to do. Rather, it's a set of end goals around intentionality. And then there leaves room within those design principles for each institution to figure out what that will look like for themselves, to adapt the principles to your context and your culture. And so we talk about these pillars, and then much of the work that we do at the institutes and when you go back to your campuses, and that you've probably already seen on your campuses, is figuring out what these principles look like, what these pillars look like for you. I should also say that building, implementing, and iterating these pillars, because it is around institutional reform, takes years, and we know that. And so there is some patience required. But the 4 principles are creating clear curricular paths, so getting rid of that cafeteria and making sure students know how to get from point A to point B. Intentionally getting students on the path so they know where they're going and why, and that they're in the right path. And then keeping students on the path, figuring out how to keep our students from beginning to end, not just our first semester students, but everyone engaged, so that you know who's struggling, who's succeeding, and you know enough about students to be able to monitor and intervene before it's too late. And then finally, ensuring that all students are learning, and learning in a way that, again, is focused on coherence and intentionality. So those learning outcomes are really supporting them getting where they want to go. It's not just a set of learning outcomes for courses, but it's a set of thinking through, what do I need to know to achieve my goals academically, but also in career and in life. These 4 pillars when built out, create a coherent, intentional, purposeful structure for students that hopefully reduces their wandering, increases their engagement, and enables us to meet them where they are pedagogically so that they learn more effectively. What does this look like in practice? I want to give you examples of each of the 4 pillars from the SUNY system. Note that these are often works in progress. Some of them may look familiar to you from your own campus, but it's nice to put some actual details on the pillars. So pillar 1, creating clear paths. This is the old version of a curriculum from a college that will remain nameless, actually not within SUNY, but it's pretty typical. It's from about 5 years ago. And you can see that if I'm a student who doesn't know what I want to do, if I'm a student who maybe isn't super familiar with the nuances of higher education, this can be really, really overwhelming. And it's really hard to figure out, what do I major in? What does it mean to pick any of these programs? How do I know? How do I not bounce around? So by creating clearer paths, we do a couple things. We leverage choice architecture and the insights of behavioral science to help students understand how they get from point A to point B. And we do that in a couple ways. The first thing we do is we create meta majors, and those are called different things on different campuses. At Jamestown, they're career communities, sometimes they're called schools, interest areas, but they essentially take that long list and group those programs under areas that make sense to a student. And now you'll note that if I clicked here, if this were a live link, that the programs didn't go away. I can still just find them. But if I'm uncertain, I can just go, oh, I want to do health, or oh, I'm interested in society. When I click on that, it brings me to just the programs that align with those interests. And so it helps guide me. The other thing that happens is within those, then the programs become more streamlined by doing things like creating curricular maps so that students know in my first semester, if I take these courses and I follow this map, I will actually get to graduation. So the students aren't expected to knit together lots of curricular choices. They're given essentially a prefix menu that says, if you follow this, you will get to graduation. So that path to their career goal or to their transfer goal becomes much clearer. If you do that, it becomes incumbent upon you to help students get on the right path, right? Because now I'm not taking lots of classes. I'm taking classes that lead to something. It better be the right something. So it's incumbent upon us to make sure that students get on the path. They get on the path early and they get on the right path. Colleges do this, and we're going to talk a lot about this, so I'm going to go through this somewhat quickly, through rethinking their onboarding processes. And that's everything from rethinking what it means to be in developmental education and how we place students there, and the curricula that we require. So things like math pathways, does every student need an algebra and calculus-based curriculum? And how do we know if they don't, who does and who doesn't? But also then thinking about using that first year to make sure students achieve very clear learning objectives that set them on the path to completion, right? So this is from Westchester Community College, and you can see that in addition to the onboarding around developmental education, which isn't even here, they have a comprehensive first year experience course that helps students make sure that they are getting on the right pathway, that they're developing a program plan, that they're understanding how to complete their coursework successfully. And they're doing that in a multimodal way through orientation, counseling, first year seminars. So you get students on the path. Now, this is a space that in the community colleges, we spend a lot of time on actually thinking about that first semester or that first year. What's been harder is to then connect that to the second year and beyond, to make sure that students then stay on their path and we keep them there intentionally. So pillar 3 and pillar 2 really go together, and it's about keeping students on a path. And that's around rethinking advising and student support and how you ensure that students are monitored, engaged, speaking to the folks who can help them, not in a sort of retroactive, almost it's too late or I have to reach out way, but in a proactive way. So the institution is intentionally reaching out to students so that if they see that a student might be falling off path, they can get to them. This is from Mohawk Valley. They're going to share more with us, I think, later, also in Institute 3. Obviously, I've covered the information with these smiley faces, but actually within each of those meta majors, there are contacts and there are assigned advisors for students. So if I'm a student now and I need help, I know exactly where to go. And these folks are responsible for keeping track of me as well. And we can build a relationship over time that lasts not just in the first year, but all the way to completion, keeping students on a path. Finally, ensuring students are learning, and this cuts across all pieces of the institution. And so I didn't pull from one specific college, but this is really reminding ourselves that learning is meaning making. And individuals make meaning in interaction with their environment. And so creating an environment curricularly, both in terms of the structure of the curriculum and those learning outcomes, but also in terms of pedagogies, contextualization, being culturally responsive, that helps our students make meaning of their courses in the context of their lives and in the context of their goals, to ensure that they're learning, they're achieving their course outcomes, but they're also achieving an understanding of how this all fits together, what it means to think like a scientist. What do you need to know if you're going to be a nurse? Why do you need psychology? How does this all fit together? So that pillar encompasses both things that happen at the curricular level and also things that happen at the classroom and individual engagement level. The bottom line is that Guided Pathways is an argument for intentionality and coherence at scale. Although we talk about the 4 pillars separately because just tactically you have to, the reality is that they cut across students' journeys, this lost momentum framework from connection all the way to completion. The idea being that we are intentionally designing, architecting students' experiences so that they are connected to our institution in a way that is meaningful to them and guides them towards their goals, that we monitor their progress, and we make sure that the incumbent is upon us to get them to completion. That's the Guided Pathways model at a very high level. I do want to quickly talk about the SUNY Guided Pathways Initiative, just so that you understand where this work sits. I'm sure you know that obviously SUNY is deeply engaged in thinking through guided pathways and other transformations, but I want you to know that they're part of a larger network around the country of states and institutions doing this work. You can see here that this is widespread. There are other institutions around the country, but these are actually state networks that are supported by an organization called Jobs for the Future, and of which this SUNY is a part. What makes SUNY unique is a couple of things. Your approach is very much institution driven. So in some states, the SUNY Guided Pathways, initiative is driven through, say, a state office. And while, of course, the SUNY central system is supportive of this work, the Guided Pathways work is being led by an institution rather than the system. In addition, the supports that are offered, there are national partners like Phase 2 Advisory, but the work is really being done, again, by institutions. You have coaches who are practitioners within the SUNY system who support their peers. It's really about building a network, and that is something that is different and important to remember. So when you come to the Institute, part of what you'll be doing is working with your campus's team, but some of what you'll be doing is actually working with teams from throughout the system, and that is deliberate, because we want you to get to know your colleagues so that as a collective, you can drive the work. That Guided Pathways is not a top-down thing. Guided Pathways and its design principles and the enaction of those design principles comes from the institutions themselves. So this was a lot of information to take in. I know that. We wanted to give you a really high-level orientation. We find that folks need to orient and reorient themselves to the model regularly over the course of their work. So don't feel like this is the only time you get to explore the model itself. You have my contact information here should you find it useful. I look forward to meeting some of you at the Institute, where we will do a question and answer session to dig into some of your wonderings. And I know that we will speak at the Institute as well on the onboarding piece of the model. Thanks for your attention. Please do reach out, and we'll see you soon.